Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing tales ever to echo through the mountains of Kentucky. Please leave a comment about where you are watching from. In the deep Appalachians, where the trees form a canopy so thick that sunlight barely touches the ground, there was a life that few people knew about. A woman named Lydia Hale chose to live in these remote areas, far from the settlements that dotted the valleys of Kentucky. She grew her own food by planting it among the old roots of the oaks and redwoods that ruled over that hilly area. People didn't go to her remote property very often because she worked the land with a dedication that was almost religious. This video is a made-up story that was made just for fun. There is no connection between this and real people, living or dead. The Appalachians had a very bad winter in 1911. The snow started to fall in October and covered the mountains with a white blanket that didn't melt until April. Lydia lived in a wooden cabin built under a cliff where the wind howled through the cracks in the rocks, making sounds that sounded like voices from another world. No one was sure how long she had been there. Some people said they had known her for 5 years, while others swore they had known her forever, as if she were part of the mountain itself. Legends have always been told in taverns and around campfires in the Appalachian region of Kentucky. Tales of travelers who went into the woods and never came back. Of people who had never been seen again. Of strange lights that danced among the trees on nights when there was no moon, and of songs that didn't come from human throats. People often talked about Lydia Hale, but only in passing, as if she were someone who was hard to understand. She would go down to the nearest town, Harland, only 2 or 3 times a year to sell baskets of wild herbs and roots for a few coins. She only spoke when she had to, and her eyes were always on the mountains, as if she heard a constant calling. What made Lydia so interesting was that she would not accept help or company of any kind. She shook her head firmly when farmers offered her winter supplies. When women from the village tried to talk to her at the market, she only said a few words and then quickly walked away. The way her shoulders were always tense and the way she stood made it seem like she was carrying a secret that no one could see. People started to wonder about her past, making up more and more complicated stories about who she might have been before she chose to live alone in the Kentucky mountains. The cabin where Lydia lived was about 8 kilometers from any known trail. To get there, you had to cross icy streams, climb rocky slopes, and find your way through woods so thick that, even during the day, darkness reigned. She had chosen the most difficult place to get to on purpose, as if she wanted to make sure that no one could just happen upon her. Home. She kept small plots of potatoes, pumpkins, and beans around the property, as well as traps for small animals that added to her diet. It was almost like she had superpowers that helped her survive in conditions that would have broken most people. Things started to change that winter of 1911. Hunters who sometimes walked the higher trails said they saw smoke coming from the area where Lydia's cabin stood, but not in a normal amount, as if. There were a lot of campfires going at the same time. Some people said they heard strange sounds echoing through the valleys at night, like a kind of singing they had never heard before. People talked about these things carefully, almost in whispers, because they didn't want to seem superstitious or dumb. But more stories kept coming out, each one adding to the mystery of Lydia Hale, who was already a very mysterious person. We need to know what was going on at that time and place. Kentucky's Appalachians were a borderland where civilization and the wild met in a fragile way. There wasn't much law in those far-off mountains, so people made up their own rules for how to live and get by. The forest was both a source of food and a danger, with wild animals and the unpredictable whims of nature being just a few of the threats it posed. Not only was it strange to live alone in those conditions, it was also a way of going against all the social norms of the time. If you like this trip through the dark secrets of Appalachia, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more scary stories that are coming up. As February drew closer, the snow kept falling on the mountains, turning the landscape into a white maze where even the most well-known paths looked different. Lydia Hale stayed in her cabin in the woods, and the quiet that surrounded her property was so deep that it seemed to have a life of its own. The trees bent under the weight of the snow that had built up, making natural arches that looked like doorways to some, a place that is not known. The wind that came down from the higher slopes was so cold that it made your bones ache. Even the animals in the forest had to hide in burrows and caves. During this time of being alone, which was made worse by the weather, something strange started to happen. Some hunters who knew those mountains well saw strange changes in the landscape on the trails that crossed that part of the Appalachians. There were strange patterns in the snow that didn't make any sense. There were no footprints of animals that are known to exist, or even of people. They were long, dragging furrows that looked like something heavy had been moved through the woods at night. They always stayed in the dark, dense areas, and stayed away from the most lit areas. People who saw these marks felt uneasy, but they couldn't put their finger on why. The furrows snaked carefully between the trees, as if the person or thing that made them had a clear goal in mind. The trails sort of led to Lydia's cabin, but they always disappeared before they got to the clearing. Where it was, as if someone had made a conscious effort to hide the last tracks. The new snow that fell all the time helped cover up this proof, but new marks always showed up the next morning. Some of these men went back to the village of Harland and told people at the local tavern what they had seen. People were skeptical at first and made jokes about how being cold for a long time can affect people's imaginations. But then more people started to speak up. One farmer said, losing a few chickens the week before and only finding feathers in the snow with no signs of a fight or predator tracks. Another man said he heard strange noises coming from the mountains at dusk. They sounded like a song or a groan, and they scared his dog so much that it hid under the porch and wouldn't come out to eat. During those cold winter days, talks about Lydia Hale took on new meanings. Someone remembered that she had never said why she had chosen that life of complete, being alone. Another person said that whenever she came to the village, her clothes always looked strange and stained, as if she worked with paints or things that she couldn't completely wash off. An older woman said she had seen Lydia gathering certain kinds of mushrooms and plants that only grew in the darkest, wettest parts of the forest. Most people stayed away from these kinds of plants and mushrooms as a safety measure. The winter of that year felt like it would never end. March came, but the cold didn't let up, and the snow kept piling up in layers that got really high in some valleys. Lydia's cabin stayed alone, and smoke would sometimes come out of the chimney, which meant she was still alive and well. But the smoke had a different quality this time. It was darker and thicker, and when the wind blew in the right direction, it smelled bad all the way to the most distant trails. It wasn't the smell of burning wood or cooking food that made me feel better. It was something else. It has a complex, almost medicinal smell, with hints of damp earth and rotting matter. Those weird tracks in the snow kept showing up at an unsettling rate. Some men tried harder to follow them because they wanted to find out where they came from, but they always lost the trail when it got to the thicker parts of the forest. That movement seemed to have a purpose, and the marks were smart enough to know how to stay hidden from the source. People who were getting angry were getting more and more upset. Saw these things happen but couldn't find explanations that made sense based on what they knew about the natural world. What worried me the most was that there were no answers about Lydia Hale herself. She had come to the area around 1906, just appearing one day as if she had grown up in the woods. She had paid for some basic supplies with gold coins, enough to build a cabin and start her crops. Since then, she had kept a respectful but impossible distance from everyone. No one knew where she came from, if she had family, or what her life was like before that. As soon as she stepped into those mountains, it was like her life had begun. As the days went by, the mood in Harland slowly changed. There were no connections, no past, and no explanations that made sense. People looked at the mountains more often, as if they were waiting for something to come out of the trees. There were now awkward pauses and furtive glances in conversations that used to flow easily. People were starting to feel like something was happening up there in the mountains, something that would eventually come down and change their lives in ways they didn't want to think about. Lydia Hale was at the center of it all, alone in her cabin, surrounded by secrets that the snow and silence kept safe. The first signs of thawing in the Kentucky Appalachian finally came in April. The snow started to melt away from the lower slopes, exposing the dark, wet ground below. Streams that had been frozen for months started to flow again, with their waters moving quickly and violently, carrying branches and other debris that had built up over the long winter. The trees were still bare, and their black branches reached out to the gray sky like skeletal fingers, but there was a quiet promise in the air that life would soon come back to those quiet mountains. There was a chance to move with the thaw. Trails that had been closed for months started to open up again, but they were still dangerous because of the deep mud and loose rocks. Rocks. Some people who lived in Harland, who had been stuck inside for months and were now curious, started to explore the mountains more. There was no set plan or official group. People just wanted to know what had happened in the more remote areas during that very harsh winter. One of these occasional explorers was a man who set traps in different parts of the mountains. He knew the winding paths that led to the most remote places very well, and his usual. The route would eventually take him close to the area where Lydia Hale's cabin was. He didn't mean to invade her privacy, but the events of the past few months had raised concerns in even the most respectful hearts. The whispered stories, the strange tracks, and the dark smoke all made it seem like someone should at least check to see if everything was okay up there in the mountains. The forest around him seemed quieter than it should be in the spring as he climbed the muddy trails. Usually, this time of year, you could hear birds coming back, small animals coming out of their winter burrows, and life waking up after months of being dormant. But on the hills that led to Lydia's land, there was only silence. The air was still and heavy with a smell he couldn't quite place, and even the wind seemed to avoid this place. It was definitely something organic, but it didn't smell like rotting leaves or spring mud. When he finally saw the cabin, he stopped suddenly in the middle of the bare trees. The scene in front of him made him feel uneasy. The structure looked like it was still standing, but the ground around it looked like it had been worked on a lot. There were mounds of fresh dirt all over the clearing, as if someone had dug and re-eeried different areas during the winter. The small plots Lydia went to were unrecognizable. The ground was turned over in ways that made no sense for farming, and there were ropes and fabrics hanging from the trees around the property that, even without a strong wind, they swayed gently, making shadows that danced. He watched for a long time from behind the trees, trying to decide whether to move closer or back away. There were no clear signs of danger, but his gut told him that something was very wrong there. The smoke coming from the chimney had stopped, which could mean that Lydia wasn't there or that something had happened. The windows of the cabin were just dark holes that you couldn't see through from far away. The piles of fresh dirt still bothered him because there were too many, and they were too big to be explained by any normal planting activity. He stood there, frozen and unsure of what to do, and began to notice other things that were bothering him. There were bones all over the property that were small and bleached from being outside. They were probably from animals that Lydia had hunted or trapped, but there were too many for one person to eat in the winter, and they were arranged in small groups around some of the mounds of earth. implied that they had been put there on purpose, not just thrown away. It was like they had a purpose he couldn't understand. He made the choice when he heard a noise coming from the cabin. It wasn't a scream or anything that made you really scared. It was more like something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor slowly. The noise stopped and then started again, coming back at random times. His heart raced, and without thinking about it, his feet started to go back the way they had come. He didn't run because that might draw attention to him, but he walked quickly, always looking over his shoulder in case he saw something or someone come out of the cabin. He stopped to catch his breath and think about what he had seen when he finally got far enough away that he thought it was safe. He could see the disturbed clearing, the mounds of fresh earth, and the bones arranged in ways that made no sense to him. He knew he had to tell someone what he had seen, but he also knew that what he said would sound too strange to be true. How could he put into words the feeling of unease that filled the whole place? That gut feeling that Lydia Hale was involved in something that was beyond what anyone else could understand. It took him the rest of the day to get back to Harland, and by the time he got to the village, the sun was already setting over the mountains. Lights started to shine in the shadows that stretched across the muddy streets, the small houses' windows. He went straight to the tavern, where he knew people would listen, even if they were skeptical. As he told his story to the people around the table, he saw their faces change from amused to worried, from skeptical to reluctantly believing, because everyone there had already heard the stories, seen the strange things, and felt uneasy about the lonely woman from the mountains. The talks that night at Harland's tavern went on for a long time. The night, which was fueled as much by alcohol as by the growing worry they all felt. The thought that someone had been doing something strange in that remote cabin during those long winter months was very disturbing. When you put the stories together over the months, they started to form a disturbing pattern. The strange noises, the dark smoke, the footprints in the snow, and now the unsettling clearing with its oddly arranged mounds of dirt and bones. That night, no one could get a good night's sleep. Minds went to dark places as they thought about what Lydia Hale could be doing all alone. She had always been a mysterious person, but until now, her strange behavior could be explained by her desire for privacy or her oddness. But now there was proof that something more was going on, something that couldn't be explained in simple terms. The most obvious question was the one that everyone was afraid to ask. What would make all that work worth it during the worst winter those mountains had ever seen? In years? As dawn broke, the low clouds let in a pale, diffuse light. A group of men gathered informally at the entrance to the village. There was no official leader or plan, but everyone knew they had to get to Lydia's cabin. It was important for the safety of the community. They told each other that they were doing it out of curiosity and fear of the unknown, but they knew that was not the whole story. They got ready with lanterns and tools, not as weapons, but as safety measures, and started the climb up the muddy paths to the mountains. It took most of the morning to get there. After the thaw, the path was hard, and there were times when they had to help each other cross swollen streams or climb slippery slopes. People didn't say much while they were climbing. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, getting ready for what he might find. The trees' bare branches made complicated patterns against the gray sky, and the forest around them seemed to be watching them. A bird would sometimes caw in the far away, but these were just isolated sounds that made the overall silence in the area even more noticeable. The group instinctively slowed down as they got closer to the clearing where the cabin was. The first man, who had been there a few days before, pointed through the trees to the disturbing scene that had made him turn away. Everyone could see the piles of dirt, the hanging clothes, and the bones that were lying around. The cabin stayed still, with no sign of movement or life. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, and the windows were just dark holes that seemed to watch them back with an emptiness that was almost too real. They waited there for a long time, looking for any sign that Lydia was there. Nothing happened. The wind had started to blow lightly, making the fabric sway and making soft whispers that sounded a lot like muffled voices. One of the men said that maybe she had left the cabin during the winter or soon after. The Thor. It was a comforting explanation, but no one really believed it. It felt like there was something in that place that they couldn't name, as if the ground itself was alive. Finally, they all got brave enough to leave the safety of the trees and go into the clearing. They walked carefully, always looking around for any sudden movement. The mounds of dirt were even scarier when you got close to them. There were a lot of them, maybe 20 or 30 all over the property, each one. About the same size as a man lying down. The ground was new and still wet from the recent thaw, and the way they were all built the same way showed that they were made with care and purpose. One of the men knelt down next to one of the mounds and looked at the bones that were arranged around it. They were definitely from small animals, mostly rabbits and squirrels, but there were also some bigger ones that could have come from deer or other animals of medium size. The way they were arranged didn't seem random, but the pattern didn't make sense to him. It looked almost like decoration, as if these remains had been put on each mound as a marker or memorial. The thought made him shudder without meaning to. Another man came up to the cabin door. The wind had started to pick up, and the jar was swaying a little. He called Lydia's name, and his voice sounded strange and too loud in that quiet place. There was no response. He called again, this time louder, and then he pushed the door wide open, letting the pale daylight flood the dark room. What? What they saw inside made everyone stop right away, and they all looked at the scene with a mix of confusion and fear. There were no people in the cabin, but it was far from empty. There were drawings and scribbles all over the walls that looked like they had been made with charcoal or something else dark. They were complicated symbols, spirals, and lines that hurt your eyes when you tried to follow them. There were more bones on the floor, arranged in concentric circles that came from. They saw a pile of clothes in the middle of the room that they knew belonged to Lydia Hale. They were neatly folded, as if she had left them there before leaving. But where could she have gone without her clothes in that cold that wouldn't go away? The group stayed at the cabin's door for a long time, and none of them wanted to go inside. The scene in front of them made no sense at all. In the dim light, the drawings on the walls looked like they were moving when they weren't. Looked at from the side. The circles of bones on the floor were very precise, which was creepy. They put each piece in the right place to finish a pattern they couldn't understand. It was like trying to read words in a language that had never been spoken before. One of the men finally crossed the line after sensing the presence of meaning, but not being able to understand it. He walked carefully so as not to mess up the floor arrangements. He looked more closely at the walls, trying to make sense of those messy signs. He noticed that there were patterns that repeated themselves in different ways, like spirals that twisted inward and never seemed to end, lines that split off and came back together to make complicated webs, and shapes that could be vaguely seen as people, but were so distorted that they were hard to tell they were people. The clothes in the middle of the room were simple, just like the practical clothes Lydia had always worn. They were clean without. Tears or stains that could mean a fight or struggle. It was like she had carefully taken them off and left them there before she left. But everyone knew what the question was. Leaving where and why? There were no other clothes in the cabin, and there was no sign that she had changed into something else. It was like she had just decided she didn't need them anymore. The other men outside the cabin started to look more closely at the piles of dirt. Someone said that maybe they should dig and find out what was buried there, but most people were not interested in the idea. Some people thought it was best to leave some things alone. They thought that digging up those hills would mean crossing an invisible line whose effects they couldn't see, Instead, they walked around the clearing looking for footprints that would show them where Lydia might have gone. When they finally found the tracks, they were confusing. They went from the cabin into the thicker forest, but they weren't normal footprints. They were leaving marks in the mud that looked like the ones that are left in the snow in the winter. They chose to go straight through the harder parts of the terrain instead of taking the easier paths. It was like whoever made them didn't care about problems or didn't see them the same way a normal person would. 2 of the men chose to follow the tracks, while the others stayed in the clearing to think about what they had found. The followers followed the trail, deeper and deeper into the woods, where the trees were so thick that it was hard to see in the light. The ground got rougher and rougher, with rocky slopes covered in wet moss and ravines where small streams flowed quickly. The tracks never changed direction. They stayed on course as if they were being guided by an unchanging sense of purpose. After walking for about an hour, they got to a place neither of them knew, even though they both knew those mountains well. It was a kind of curved rock walls made a natural amphitheater that made a partially sheltered circular area. There was no grass or other plants on the ground. It was just bare stone. In the middle was a crack in the rock that led down into complete darkness. The tracks went right to that crack and then just stopped, as if Lydia had walked right into it. They carefully walked up to the opening and looked inside. The darkness was so thick that it swallowed up any light that tried to get through. When one of them they threw a small stone into the crack, and it took a few seconds for them to hear something hit the bottom far away. It was very deep, much deeper than any cave they had ever been in, and from that darkness came a stream of cold air, not just cold but icy, and it carried with it the same strange smell they had smelled around the cabin, which smelled like medicine and nature at the same time. Neither of the men suggested going down. There were limits to bravery, and that crack in the rock was one of those limits. Limits. Instead, they mentally marked the spot by remembering the unique rock formations around it so they could find it again if they needed to. After that, they started the long trip back to where the others were waiting. Their minds were full of unanswered questions and images that would stay with them for a long time. When they got back to the clearing, they saw that the rest of the group was outside the cabin, looking upset about something. One of them said they had found something else inside, something they hadn't seen at first. There were pots and jars in the small kitchen that held things they couldn't identify. There were thick liquids that were dark brown to pale green, powders that glowed in the dark, and preserved plant roots that none of them knew. There was also a notebook-like thing with pages full of those weird symbols, along with some drawings of plants and maps that could be maps, or directions for something they couldn't understand. When they finally decided to go back to Harland, the sun was starting to set. They brought the notebook with them, hoping that someone in the village could figure it out, but none of them really thought it would happen. They didn't change anything else. It was a quiet choice not to disturb that place any more than they already had. As they walked down the trails in the fading light, they all looked back every now and then, half expecting to see. They thought they saw something come out of the forest behind them, but all they saw were the trees, the long shadows, and the quiet that seemed to have settled in that part of the mountain range. After people found the empty cabin, things changed in the village of Harland in a big way. There was a new kind of tension in the air, and everyone knew that something strange had happened right there in the mountains around their homes. The notebook they had brought from Lydia's cabin was passed around and looked at by everyone who thought they could figure it out, but the symbols were still impossible to read. A man who had traveled a lot when he was younger and seen a lot of strange things thought that the symbols might be a kind of personal writing, a code Lydia had made for herself. Some people thought they might be drawings that didn't mean anything in words, just pictures. An expression of a mind that had gone too far away from what everyone else saw as real. The plant drawings were just as strange. They showed species that looked familiar at first, but when you looked more closely, they showed details that were impossible. Leaves with patterns that didn't follow any natural symmetry and roots that twisted together in ways that didn't make sense to botanists. The cabin in the mountains, on the other hand, stayed the same. No one wanted to go back there or had the guts to do so. Everyone agreed that it should be left alone, and that more interference could lead to things they didn't want to think about. Interference could have effects they didn't want to think about. The symbols on the walls, the bone circles on the floor, and the fabrics hanging from the trees would all stay the same. They would be a silent reminder of something that had happened but that no one could fully understand. As spring went on, May came, and the Appalachians finally got real warmth. The trees burst into green leaves, covering the mountains with a bright blanket that stood out sharply from the emptiness of winter. Wild. There were flowers all over the slopes, and the animals that had been hiding during the cold months could now be seen and heard everywhere. Life came back to the area in full force, but there were still places that seemed to fight against this new life. The area around Lydia's cabin stayed strangely quiet. The plants grew in strange shapes and patterns, and the animals stayed away. People sometimes said they saw strange lights in that direction at night, pale glimmers that moved around the trees in a strange way. Some said they heard sounds they couldn't place. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. It was something else that made their skin crawl and their hearts race for no clear reason. People talked about these things in low voices, almost ashamed because they didn't want to seem superstitious or foolish. But they kept coming in, each one adding to the mystery of Lydia Hale and what happened to her. People talked about what to do with the land. It was technically abandoned, which meant that someone else could eventually claim it, according to the rules of the time. But no one cared at all. Everyone thought it was completely unacceptable to live in that cabin, farm that messed-up land, and sleep in a place where those symbols covered the walls. People started to avoid the property on purpose when they were planning their routes through the mountains. The summer of 1911 was very hot and dry. Small hot spots started to show up in the mountains because the plants were dry and the weather was so bad. People were always worried that one of these hot spots might spread and threaten the village, so groups of men kept watch over the mountains for signs of trouble. Someone saw something strange during one of these vigils. There was a strange mist that sometimes rose from the area around Lydia's cabin, but it wasn't the kind of fog that is common in the mountains. It was thicker, and had a greenish tint that rose in vertical columns before fading away in the upper layers of the atmosphere. Seeing it made them very upset right away. If it wasn't fog from nature, what was making that shape? Had someone gone back to the cabin? Could Lydia have come back? Or was there another reason that they didn't want to think about too much? A small group decided to look into it and climbed the now familiar trails toward the clearing that had haunted there. Thoughts since April. When they got there, the cabin was just like they had left it. But the air felt different. They could smell the same strange mix of medicinal and organic smells that they had noticed before. The clearing itself also looked different in interesting ways. The land around the property looked like it had been shaped by natural forces, with small hills and valleys making wavy patterns across the ground. Plants grew in some of these places that none of them recognized, with stems that looked almost like crystals and leaves that were shaped in strange ways, like they were bending at odd angles. The mist they had seen from afar seemed to come from different parts of the clearing. It wasn't from burning, it was some kind of condensation or exhalation that was rising naturally from the ground. Being too close made me feel a little dizzy and out of place. So they stayed at a respectful distance. The whole clearing seemed to be changing, turning into something that wasn't there before. Not completely natural anymore, but also not the result of normal human interference. It was like Lydia's presence and the things she did during that long winter had changed that place in a way that was only just starting to show itself. They didn't stay for long. The feeling of unease was too strong. The feeling that watching those changes for too long could have bad effects that they didn't want to risk. They hurried down, their heads full of questions that needed answers. Questions. What had Lydia done? What was going on in that land that now gave off strange mists and grew plants that couldn't live? And most importantly, where was she now? And what had she turned into after she went missing in that crack in the rocks? The situation was starting to seem more and more like something that people couldn't understand. Something that worked according to rules they didn't know, and a mystery that might never be fully solved. And as summer went on in Kentucky, that unsettling clearing in the mountains was still an impossible question mark, a place where reality seemed to have been bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. Summer kept going on and on across the Appalachian Mountains, bringing with it a drought that no one could remember seeing before. The streams that usually flowed strongly through the area shrank to thin trickles, and some even dried up completely, leaving only rocky beds exposed to the hot sun. The plants on the lower slopes started to turn yellow and die, and farmers became more and more worried about their crops. But even though there was a lot of drought in the area, the land around Lydia's cabin seemed to do very well. The strange plants that had started to grow out of the mounds of dirt grew thick, and their leaves stayed green and firm even when it didn't rain. As summer went on, there were more and more sightings in that area. Some men who were watching for fires said they saw things moving in the woods near the cabin at dusk that didn't look like anything they knew. Animals. These descriptions were vague and unclear because the people who saw them were always far away, and the light was always fading when these things happened. But the reports were consistent enough to make people uneasy. There was movement in that area. Something that was hard to see but impossible to deny was there. A woman from the village, who was known for her knowledge of herbs and ability to use medicinal plants, said she wanted to look at the unknown plants growing around the hut. She said that they might have useful properties, maybe even medicinal ones that should be looked into. But when she was told exactly what the plants looked like, with their stems being see-through and their leaves bending at angles that seemed to go against normal plant structure, she quickly changed her mind. There was knowledge in her eyes, some recognition of something she didn't want to name, and she strongly told everyone to stay away from those plants and anything else that grew in that cursed land. In July, especially dark nights without a moon. It was on one of these nights that something happened that made the mystery even more creepy. A young man who was coming home late from a nearby farm saw lights in the woods on a path that went fairly close to Lydia's property. They weren't regular lanterns or torches. They were phosphorescent lights that pulsed like they were breathing. They moved through the trees in ways that made it look like they were smart and had a plan. Sometimes they came together before, spreading out again. He couldn't decide whether to run away or keep watching because he was both fascinated and scared at the same time. The lights finally started to move toward him, waking him up from the trance he was in. He ran down the trail without looking back, and his feet found their way on their own, more by instinct than by sight in the dark. He was out of breath and clearly shaken when he finally got to the village. People believed his story because they all knew he was a smart and sensible person, a person you can trust. If he said he saw those lights, then they must have been real in some way, even if we can't explain what they were. There were more reports of sounds and lights in the days that followed. During the darkest hours of the night, songs that didn't come from people or animals echoed through the mountains. They were songs. If they could be called that, they seemed to have a structure and pattern, but they made people who heard them feel very uncomfortable, some said. Feeling sick when you hear those sounds for too long. Some people said they had disturbing dreams the nights after hearing them. They dreamed of huge underground places, roots that went on forever through the ground, and whispers in languages that had never been spoken in the sun. Things were clearly getting worse in some way, heading toward something that no one could see coming, but that everyone was afraid of. Some people thought they should burn the cabin, destroy the mounds of dirt, and get rid of everything else. Everything Lydia had left behind, but the idea met with unexpected resistance. Some said that getting involved could make things worse and that maybe what was happening needed to happen on its own, no matter how upsetting it was. Some people were just too scared to get close enough to carry out such a plan. August came, bringing with it sudden and violent storms that came without warning and went away just as quickly. People were afraid of what might happen if they directly provoked what was happening in that changed land. Fast. Lightning hit the area around Lydia's cabin many times during one of these storms. People who were far away saw the forest light up for a few seconds, as if it were day, and saw shapes that shouldn't have been there. Shapes that were both plants and other things, and structures that grew much faster than any plant should have been able to. After the storm passed and the sun came back, smoke could be seen coming from several places in that area. But it wasn't smoke from a normal fire. That's what it was. The same dark, thick breath they had seen before, but now it was more intense and more of it. A group made the decision to look into it again. They needed to know what was going on before it got completely out of hand. They climbed the trails on a clear morning, not with weapons, but with determination and a sense of duty to keep everyone in the village safe. When they got to the clearing, they stood at the edge of the forest for a long time, trying to understand how impossible it was. Of the scene in front of them. The cabin was still there, but it was almost completely hidden by those weird plants. Their stems had grown over the wooden walls, making a thick network that looked like it was pumping sap or some other fluid through them with an invisible heart. The leaves, if you could call them that, were now the size of plates and had an almost crystalline quality, reflecting sunlight in kaleidoscopic patterns. The mounds of earth were no longer recognizable as such. They had become one with each other, through a root system that could be seen on the surface of the soil, making a network that looked like veins under clear skin and covered the whole clearing. The air was thick with the smell of medicine and plants, which was now mixed with floral notes that were both attractive and disgusting. As I got closer, I felt like I was going to fall over, as if gravity had changed a little bit in that spot. The trees that surrounded the clearing had changed as well. The colors of their leaves had changed to deep purples and other colors that don't exist in nature. The greens were shiny, and their branches bent toward the middle of the clearing, as if they were being pulled by a magnetic force. There was something completely different in the middle of it all, where Lydia's pile of clothes used to be. It was hard to describe well because it looked different from different angles. It sometimes looked like a huge plant structure, like a cocoon or pod that was the size of a person. It looked more like a mineral than an organic thing at other times, like a crystal that had grown from the ground. And sometimes when the light hit it just right, it looked almost see-through, showing something inside that might have been a person, but it was distorted and changed in ways that made your eyes hurt when you tried to focus. They all had to leave the clearing after a short time. The feeling of unease was so strong that it felt like a physical force pushing them away. But before they left, they were able to see one more thing that would stay in their minds forever. The split in thee. From the middle of the clearing, a perfectly straight line of dead plants made it easy to see the rocks that Lydia's tracks had led to. It was like something had made a direct line of sight between those 2 points, a hallway that connected the 2 places, but not in a way that they could fully understand. Their faces were sad and their steps were heavy as they went back down to Harland. They told what they had seen, but there. It seemed like words weren't enough to describe how that change really was. How could they explain the feeling that the clearing was no longer fully in their world, but rather a place where the known and the unknown met? How could they get people to understand that Lydia Hale had started something that was still growing and changing, something that had never happened before in any human experience they knew? The question that no one wanted to ask out loud was the most disturbing of all. What? What would happen when that change was done? What would come out of that building in the middle of the clearing? And would it still look like Lydia Hale, or would it have changed into something else that they couldn't name or understand? As summer came to an end and fall approached, everyone felt that something was about to happen. It was the end of that mysterious process that had started the previous winter and continued to unfold toward an end. A place that is not known. September brought the first cool breezes, which meant that summer was over in the Appalachians. The leaves on the trees slowly changed colors, turning gold and red, which are colors that people usually celebrate as beautiful in the fall. But that year, the change of season brought with it a sense of fear that spread throughout the whole settlement of Harland. People looked at the mountains more and more often, seeing the dark smoke that kept rising from that cursed place, region, waiting for something to happen that would make things clear. The nights got longer, and the air got that clear, crisp quality that is common in the mountains in the fall. During these nights, the strange things that were happening around Lydia's old property got worse. The phosphorescent lights that some people had seen before now appeared all the time, moving between the trees in more and more complicated ways. Sometimes they made spirals that went up into the sky. Other times they spread out like glowing webs across the sky, linking one tree to another. People who saw the lights said they seemed to be getting bigger and bigger, moving farther and farther away from the original clearing, as if the event was growing and taking over more space. The sounds had changed as well. The strange chants that had been going on all summer were replaced by something else, something deeper and more resonant. It was almost like a constant hum that you could feel as well as hear, a vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. A few people in Harland said they felt this vibration even inside their homes, especially in the hours before dawn when everything else was quiet. It was always there, a constant reminder that something was still happening in those mountains, something that didn't care about the lines that people like to draw between the natural and the impossible. A farmer who lived on the slopes closest to the area that was affected started to see changes in his own land. Little patches of strange plants showed up in his fields, plants that were see-through and had strange shapes, just like the ones that grew around Lydia's cabin. He tried to pull them out, but they always came back, growing back overnight as if their roots went deeper than any tool could reach. His animals started to act strangely, too. They wouldn't graze in some areas and would nervously gather away from the parts of his property that were affected. It was clear that the situation was getting worse and worse, contained in that small clearing, but slowly spreading through the forest around it. People were starting to feel more and more like they needed to do something because they knew that if nothing was done, this contamination or change or whatever it was would eventually reach the village itself. But what could be done? Every time I tried to get closer to the source of the phenomenon, I felt sick and confused. And even when people were able to get close, they found that they're common. Tools and methods were not enough to deal with something that seemed to follow rules that were different from those that govern the known natural world. One night in late September, when the sky was dark and cold and there were no stars, something big happened. A sound that echoed through the mountains like a long rumble of thunder woke everyone in Harlem at the same time. But it wasn't thunder. It was something more natural and planned, like the earth itself was, groaning or yelling. The noise went on for several minutes, pulsing in waves that shook windows and made small things fall off shelves. Then, just as suddenly as it started, It stopped, leaving a silence that felt thicker and heavier than any sound. When the sun came up, it showed a change that could be seen from a distance. There was a pale light around Lydia's cabin that didn't seem to come from anywhere. It wasn't the light from the rising sun bouncing off of wet surfaces. It was a light that seemed to come from the plants, the rocks, and the air. It was like the whole area had become phosphorescent, making it stand out from everything else around it. And instead of smoke rising from that central point, there was something that looked like a column of distorted air. The light itself bent and rippled as if it were passing through something denser than it should have been. A group formed naturally in the village, with people gathering on the main street without being asked to. Everyone was aware that something important had happened during the night, and everyone knew they had to go see it for themselves. The trip to the clearing was made in tense silence. Everyone was lost in their own worries and thoughts. The path looked different in some way, as if the forest had changed a little and the trails didn't quite follow the routes they remembered. When they got to the edge of the clearing, they both stopped as if they were one being. Neither of them wanted to. Go ahead and take the next step on your own. What they saw was so strange that it couldn't be explained or even fully understood by human senses. The cabin was gone, not destroyed, but changed into a huge building that rose from the middle of the clearing. It was a mix of plant, mineral, and something else that couldn't be classified. Huge stems rose up like the pillars of a strange cathedral, and they were connected by membranes that let light through and changed its color in ways that were impossible. And at the center of this structure, it was suspended in the air, as if it were floating in an invisible liquid. It could have been Lydia Hale. In the most abstract sense, it looked like a person. It was about the same size and shape as a person, but its surface was smooth and shiny. There were only hints of eyes, mouth, and nose where facial features should have been, like wet porcelain or polished tree bark. There were no actual features, and those same veins or roots that covered the clearing, which made it closely linked to all the living networks that had grown since it was supposed to leave months ago. People were too scared to go into the clearing. It was clear that crossing that line would be like entering a place where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. The air in the clearing felt thicker, like water under oil, and it moved in unseen currents. There were sounds coming from there, but they weren't sounds that people could hear. In the right way. Frequencies that made me feel uncomfortable and like something was trying to talk to parts of my brain that usually stayed quiet. The shape that was hanging in the middle started to move slowly as they watched. It didn't move like limbs would, but instead it moved in a fluid way along its entire length. Those hints of facial features seemed to be pointing at them, and for a scary moment, they felt like they were being seen, recognized and judged by something that was no longer Lydia Hale, but still had some memory or echo of who she had been. It was very disturbing to be watched by something that was both familiar and completely strange, something that had crossed a line and could never go back. Then, just as quickly as that attention had caught their eye, it pulled back, going in a direction that people don't know how to describe in words. The shape went back to being still, and the structure around it pulsed with brighter light once before settling down again. The group slowly backed away, keeping their eyes on the clearing until the trees completely blocked their view. The whole way back to Harlem, no one said a word. They couldn't find the right words to describe what they had seen, or how big the impossible was in those mountains now. In October, the relationship between the village of Harland and what had settled in the mountains changed in a big way. You could no longer ignore or just stay away from that impossible change. The clearing's glow had become visible even during the day, and if you looked in the right direction, you could see it from the village streets. At night, it was even more obvious, making an artificial aurora that painted the low clouds with pale green and iridescent blue colors that didn't exist in any natural rainbow. people started to dream. Not all at once, but slowly, one by one, the people of Harland woke up from nights of trouble with memories of visions that had things in common. They imagined routes going on forever through the dark underground. Huge rooms carved into the living rock where things grew in complete silence, and a humanoid shape floating in its crystal structure, reaching out with what could be arms, tentacles, or branches. The dreams weren't violent or scary in the usual way, but they had a heavy meaning that was almost too much to handle, as if they were being exposed to ideas that the human mind couldn't handle well. A woman who had been having these dreams very strongly started to act strangely. Hours would pass as she sat on her porch, staring blankly at the mountains and mumbling words that didn't make sense in any language. When her family tried to talk to her or get her to come inside, she would answer, but her answers were all over the place and didn't seem to connect. More. It was disturbing that she started drawing compulsively, covering sheets of paper with symbols that looked eerily like the ones they had seen on the walls of Lydia's cabin months before. It wasn't only her. Other people also started to act differently, but to different degrees. A blacksmith found that his hands would involuntarily make patterns in the air, tracing complicated geometric shapes that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on them. A kid drew drawings of plants that weren't real with botanical accuracy that was impossible for someone his age. When asked where he learned that, he just pointed to the mountains and said that the plants showed him what they were like. It was clear that the phenomenon was having an effect on people that went beyond just seeing something strange. It was as if that structure in the mountains was sending out signals and having an effect on people without them having to touch it directly. Some people thought that dreams were a way for something to talk to us when our conscious minds were asleep and our defenses were low. Some people thought that it might be something in the air, like tiny particles or spores from those impossible plants that the wind was carrying to the village. The strange plants kept growing through the forest without stopping. The farmer who first saw the plants growing on his land now saw big parts of them. Of his fields changed. The ground there looked different. It was darker and had a texture that made it feel both wetter and drier than regular soil. The plants that grew from it thrived in ways that went against everything we know about farming. They grew without needing water or direct sunlight. Their roots went so deep that any attempt to remove them was completely useless. It seemed like wild animals were coming to the village more often than usual, as if they were running away from something in the mountains. Deer came down in groups during the day. Very strange behavior for animals that are usually very careful. Birds flew in groups that weren't very organized. Their erratic paths made it look like they were confused or scared. And then there were the animals that seemed to be changing in the same way that the plants were. A dog was found on the streets with fur that had a faint glow to it. A rabbit seen on the edge of the village had eyes that reflected light in a way that rabbit eyes shouldn't have an internal glow that hinted at big changes in its biology. There were serious talks about leaving Harland behind and moving everyone to bigger, farther away towns in the mountains. But these talks always hit roadblocks, both practical and emotional. A lot of families had lived there for a long time. Their histories and identities were tied to that land. There was also the fear that leaving the village wouldn't be enough, and that the change would keep spreading even if there weren't any people there to see it. If they were going to deal with what was going on, it might be better to do it from places they were already familiar with. Time went on, and that October of 1911 became more and more strange. The trees around the village finished changing for the fall, but the colors weren't what people thought they would be. Along with the usual reds and golds, there were also strange colors like purples that looked like they were vibrating, greens that were both deep and bright, and yellows that made you squint when you looked at them. It was as if nature's color palette had grown beyond its normal range, adding colors that are only visible to the edges of human perception. The building in the clearing kept getting bigger. People watching from a distance said that it was now much taller than before, with its pillars reaching heights of up to 20 meters and being connected by those clear membranes that stretched. The shape in the middle, which had been Lydia Hale, looked like it had grown, or maybe even multiplied. The sails of a ghostly ship were between them. Sometimes it looked like one thing, and other times it looked like several things floating at different levels within the structure, all connected by a network of veins or cords that were always moving. The sounds changed over time. That deep hum that had become part of the environment was now sometimes broken up by higher notes and tones that came together to make something that could almost be music, if music could be made with instruments that didn't follow the rules of sound physics. People who heard these impossible melodies were deeply moved by them. Some people said they felt inexplicable ecstasy and a deep understanding of truths they couldn't put into words. Others felt a deep fear, a primal horror that came from realizing that something was completely foreign and hard to understand. One night in late October, the structure sent out a pulse of light that was so strong that it lit up the whole area around it as if it were noon. The pulse only lasted a few seconds, but it made a lasting impression on everyone who saw it. And after the pulse, when everything was quiet, the air changed. It was like everyone had crossed an invisible line that couldn't be seen, but could be felt. After that, it was clear that the process that started when Lydia Hale went into that crevice in. The rocks were getting close to some kind of endpoint months before. People in Harlan started to get ready, but no one knew what for. They got supplies, looked for ways to get away, and kept an eye on the edges of the village all the time. People felt like something was going to happen that would change everything in ways they couldn't see. Some prayed, looking for comfort in their old beliefs when they couldn't understand what was going on. Others, they just waited, watching the mountains with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. The changed plants were now visible on the lower slopes, getting closer to the village. It didn't grow in straight lines. Instead, it grew in patterns that looked like they were being guided by intelligence. It avoided some types of terrain while favoring others, and it formed networks that connected different transformed areas into a single system. It was like watching a huge creature stretch out its limbs, explore, and take back land based on rules that only it understood. And throughout all of this, the shape at the center of the structure stayed the same, appearing to be still but giving off a sense of focused attention, as if it were watching and waiting for something that only it knew was coming. Lydia Hale had started a change that affected more than just her own life. She had either made or called forth something that lived at the crossroads of the living and the dead, the natural and the impossible, the known and the unknown that the human mind had trouble understanding, put into groups. And now, in the last weeks of that strange fall, that creation was about to show its true purpose in ways that no one in Harlan could have imagined in their worst nightmares. November came to Appalachia, and with it came the first signs of winter. In the mornings, the first frosts covered the ground, and the air had that sharp quality that meant snow was coming. But even though nature went through its usual cycle of seasons, the area around Lydia Hale's old estate seemed to be stuck in time, outside of that cycle, working according to rhythms and rules that didn't see the passage of time in the same way. The crystalline structure had grown to be huge, taking over that part of the mountain. Its clear membranes now caught light in ways that made rainbows that couldn't exist, color spectrums that went beyond what we could see, and frequencies that could be felt on the skin as either heat or cold, depending on the angle. The form that was suspended in the middle had changed into something else, a shadow that changed shape all the time, sometimes looking like a person and other times looking completely different. something that might not have had a physical form in the usual sense. The dreams that bothered the people of Harland got worse in the first few weeks of November. They weren't just dreams anymore. They were full experiences that felt more real than being awake. People woke up with memories of walking through those underground rooms and touching those wet walls. Walls where things grew in ways that didn't make sense, and whispers and languages that made sense at the time but didn't when I woke up. Everyone felt that something was trying to send a message or share some knowledge through the only means available. The changed plants kept growing at an unstoppable rate. But now something else was going on. It didn't just replace the native plants. It started to mix them in, changing them from the inside out. Hundreds of years old. The bark of oaks started to show those same see-through qualities. Common shrubs got that glow that looks like phosphorescence. It felt like the line between the normal and the changed was fading away. As everything slowly moved into the new state of being that Lydia had started, something big happened on a very cold morning in mid-November. The constant hum that had become part of the environment stopped suddenly, leaving a silence so deep it felt like it was real. Intensity. Everyone in Harland felt the same silence at the same time. It was an absence that was more unsettling than any sound had ever been. There was nothing for a few hours, just that empty sound that seemed to suck all the energy out of the air. And then, as the afternoon went on, and the shadows grew longer across the mountains, the structure in the clearing began to glow more and more. It wasn't the quick flash of light that had happened before. It was a slow build-up, The light got brighter and brighter until it was easy to see, even in the middle of the day. The light was a bright white that looked like it had all the colors at once. When you looked directly at it, you felt dizzy, as if your eyes couldn't focus on something that was there in more than one dimension at the same time. People left their homes and gathered in the streets of Harland to watch the strange event in the mountains, with a mix of fear and something that could be seen as respect. They felt like they were seeing something important, a moment that changed everything and went beyond their own lives to touch on something deeper about the nature of reality. Nobody said anything. Everyone just stood there and watched as the light got bigger. The shape in the middle of the building started to move in more planned ways than it had before. People who were watching through binoculars or from high places said they saw something that looked like a dance or performance, with movements that were strange, and a purpose that they couldn't understand. And as it moved, the structure itself reacted. Its membranes moved in time with the movement, and its pillars pulsed with light that followed the movement's rhythm. Then, as the sun touched the western horizon and painted the sky orange and purple, something came out of the structure. It wasn't violent or dramatic. It was more like a flower opening its petals. Forms started to move away from that center. Entity, pieces of consciousness or presence floating outward through the clear membranes. They looked a lot like the main form, but they were smaller and had the same quality of being in between states, being both solid and ethereal, alive and something else. These smaller shapes started to move through the changed forest, not by walking, but by gliding or floating, leaving trails of light behind them. They didn't go near the village, but they moved in ways that made it look like, touching trees and rocks and leaving marks that glowed softly even after they had left. It was like watching seeds fall from a mother plant. Each one had the power to make something new wherever it landed. It was completely dark outside, and those shapes kept spreading across the mountains, making moving constellations of light in the trees. The main structure stayed bright, like a beacon that could be seen for miles. And slowly, as the hours went by, as time went on, a new sound started to come out. It wasn't the old hum or the impossible melodies. It was something softer, almost like a hug. It was like the sound of wind through leaves or water running over rocks, but it had harmonies that these sounds couldn't make on their own. People in Harlan stayed up all night to see the show in the mountains. There were times when they were scared, but there were also times when they felt something deeper, like awe at the unknown. They realized that they were seeing something that would change their view of what was possible in the world forever. Lydia Hale had become something beyond human, beyond even categories like life and non-life, and through her something new had entered their reality. When dawn finally came, it brought pale light through the low clouds. The structure in the clearing had changed once more. It was smaller now, like it had done what it needed to do and didn't need to be there anymore. Huge display. The forms that had scattered during the night were no longer visible, but you could feel them everywhere. A consciousness that was spread out throughout the changed forest. And at the center of it all was Lydia, who had changed but was still there, a bridge between what had been and what was now. The days that followed brought a kind of reluctant acceptance. The transformation had happened and could not be undone. The forest around Harlem would always be different, with things that didn't fit into any of the known categories. But life would go on, because it always does, even in the worst situations. It adapts and finds new ways to keep things in balance. People would learn to live with that mystery, keeping a respectful distance but knowing that their lives were now connected to something that went beyond what most people could understand. The story of Lydia Hale became part of the mountains, whispered on dark nights and thought about when things were quiet. A woman who had chosen to be alone and, through that choice, had found or made something that went against everything we thought we knew about reality. The Appalachian Mountains kept their secrets, as they always had. People who lived in their shadows learned to accept that some questions would never have answers that people could fully understand. If this journey through the unknown and the impossible moved you, you might want to subscribe to the channel for more stories that look at the line between what is known and what is not. Not able to be explained.